I would like to introduce the man who really doesn't need any introduction at all, but I will nonetheless, and that is Andreas Schleicher, Deputy Director of Education and Skills for the OECD. But perhaps more importantly for the likes of me and the other journalists in the room, this is the man who has caused outbreaks of PISA envy across the known world, bringing education ministers, educationalists, and sometimes journalists on deadlines out in a sweat as he has produced his extremely thorough and useful research on the state of global education and raised, I think, some truly fascinating and often rather awkward questions about the performance of various countries. But of course, Andreas also produces or helps produce many other pieces of vital education research, not least the adult skills audit that the OECD does, and many other reports which link into that. I believe you have an upcoming one that Andreas might like to tell us a bit about in a moment. Our focus now for about the next 50 minutes is going to be the gap between what schools teach and what school leavers have under their belt when they leave their desks and what employers want. You will think, gosh, well, I never seem to be talking about anything else in education these days. But I hope that in this slightly more personal setting, with Andreas kindly putting himself at our disposal, that we can ask perhaps a few more questions that go beyond merely acknowledging that this is the major issue and perhaps explore some ways in which the kind of research that the OECD and others have done might lead us towards the promised land, or at least a major leap forward. So I'm going to talk to Andreas for a bit, but don't worry, store up your questions. I would really like to get round the room and get many questions in and a lot of dialogue, trialogue, or multilogue going while, of course, you enjoy your lunch. So Andreas, this gap between skills and what is required in the workplace, one might be forgiven for thinking, you cover education or as interested as the people at this conference, that this is almost a fad of interest. Do you see it as a gap that has opened up and we simply haven't noticed it? Or has something else material changed that we have to give it our focus now?
Well, you know, if you think about it, half a century ago, if you were a teacher, you could assume that what you teach is going to last for the lifetime of your students. That was how our economies were working. Today, that's no longer enough. I mean, in fact, the fundamental issue is that the world economy no longer pays you for what you know. Google knows everything. It pays you for what you can do with what you know, and that requires a very, very different approach to education. It requires a much greater focus on ways of thinking, you know, creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, on ways of working, collaboration, teamwork, on tools for working, the kind of literacy skills of the 21st century, and dissecting information, dealing with ambiguity, navigating your own way through information, moving away from reproducing what you learn in schools towards extrapolating from it. And I do think that is quite different today. And that's, I don't know what I can do about that. I can speak louder or move my microphone closer. Is it better now?
How is that?
And
I think it's going to be like one of those nights at a discotheque in which the people at the front are going to leave with hearing problems for the future, and you at the back will be saying, what was that? Is that a little better at the back of the room? Show us you're there, go on. Just about. I'm sorry, we are fighting, I think, against a quite interesting design and acoustic, and we'll do our best to be clear without
I mean, one of the things that we did not see 50 years ago, and that is now a prominent issue, is this toxic mix of, on the one hand, unemployed graduates on the street, people who are well educated, not being able to find work, and yet employers scrambling for people with the skills they need. And I think that's a quite new situation, at least in those dimensions. There's no signal of over-education in our economies. There is a signaling of mismatch.
Tell me a bit more, if you could, about that, the toxic. You used a very strong word there, and it comes up again and again, certainly in my day job as public policy editor of The Economist. You know, I would say pretty much 1 in every 3 education-related reports that I cover or events has this as a theme. It is easy to diagnose. It is perhaps not so easy to find the right track to a result. Now, what for you is the approach that education systems need to change to closing that gap?
Well, first of all, there are some education systems that are actually doing really well on this, that have sort of the schools have the eyes and ears to see how the labor demand is evolving. There is very close engagement of the business sector and society more generally in the way an education is framed. Workplace learning is the reality. You have people deciding
where would they be, for example?
I think if you look at employer engagement in learning, Switzerland is a great example, or Germany, or Austria. If you look at sort of lifelong, life-wide learning, you know, people deciding when they learn, how they learn, where they learn. You go to the Nordic countries in Europe. China, a great example as well, where there are sort of many more opportunities opening up. So I think actually this is not an impenetrable problem. We actually have a lot of really good solutions out there.
But I'm interested in some of the examples you mentioned there, that just, if you look at, you know, the people that you know, the countries, sorry, that you name-checked, they don't seem to align very obviously with overall education performance as you would measure it on PISA. I mean, Austria is hardly a star of the PISA firmament. So is there a danger that we get too fixated on the league tables that PISA produces and not enough on what actually happens afterwards when you pin the certificate to the bedroom wall?
Yeah, you know, I think we need to, having any single indicator is never healthy. We should be stronger on measuring success on the long-term labor market and social outcomes of school. Now, that's where we have to get to, sort of thinking through, you know, did you need to learn as a primary grade students or secondary grade students to be successful some years down the road. And I think those systems need to be better aligned. PISA or performance indicators are actually reasonably well predictive for later success, but they're only part of the story. And the focus of schooling really needs to be on the long term.
So if that focus is, just from what picking up from what you're saying, is more employer involvement, a greater awareness in education systems from the ground up about where they're heading, what mechanisms do you see coming on stream? And I'm wondering here whether ed tech and the kind of evolution really that we've been talking about this morning with the signing of the GEMS agreement with edX, do you see that playing directly into this? Or is there a danger, which I think a lot of skeptics would feel, and they may not be well represented at this conference, but they certainly exist because they write to me, that you just end up with a lot of faddling about with an iPad?
I don't know. I think, you know, we need to move away from this idea of public versus private to public with private, you know? And it starts with the development of instructional systems. Who is best in knowing what skills are most in demand? It's those people who use those skills. So we need to get them into the table of where we develop content, where we develop instructional systems. Technology. You know, I mean, that's the solution. Why do you want to have the teacher next door when you can have access to the best content in the world? We need to unbundle educational content, delivery, and accreditation. I think when we do those things, we'll find that there are a lot of really positive synergies. And I'm not talking about the financing of education. I'm talking about, you know, who is best positioned to actually provide what kind of skills. No?
But if you look at something like K-12, which I think is only just beginning to come onto the sort of discussion agenda in the way that MOOCs in universities began to do so in 2012, the so-called year of the MOOC, which makes it sound like a strange creature from mythology. What do you think the next step is then in terms of getting that debate moving in a direction where the response of many people in education will simply be, well, this is all right, is a bit of an add-on, but frankly, I've got enough on my plate. I've got the government on my back trying to get me to get 2 points up the PISA table. Can I really take on a kind of technological transformation, which frankly, I think would cause a problem or at least a big challenge for many big companies, let alone education systems, which are not always the best managed institutions in any country.
Yeah, you know, you need to open up more space for that, but I don't think that is not feasible. I mean, think about where governments have spent a lot of more money, or countries have spent a lot of more money on education over the last 10, 15 years. Education has fared really well on spending. But most of the money has gone into making things like making classes smaller. And that means actually that teachers are squeezed out of that process. They don't have more time to do other things because the money is being spent to sort of in a specific way. And I think
I'm just going to interrupt you there because you say the small classes, and I know you have some there was a bit of research this morning that came up in one of the sessions, counterintuitive for a lot of people about class size. What's your direct opinion about class size?
Well, I mean, you know, if you ask politicians, they will favor small classes because it does make you very popular very quickly. If you ask schools, actually, you know, here you have a bucket of resources. How do you spend that most intelligently? Schools generally make wise spending choices. They make the right choice because, you know, how much time does a teacher need to teach as opposed to doing other things or working? And what is very clear is high-performing education systems consistently prioritize the quality of teaching over the size of classes. You see that in East Asia, you see that in Northern Europe, and it's not a popular choice. It may be counterintuitive, but it's counterintuitive because we value schools on what we see. And as long as we do not see the results that are achieved, we value them on things like class sizes. That's what you see as a parent.
I understand that as a sort of diagnosis, but I have to say it's one of those things where occasionally you see that practical experience does seem to run rather counter to the diagnosis. If you look at a high-performing private school system like the UK, what does the thing that a lot of parents will mention as the driver? They will say the smaller class size. They feel in some way that that more direct contact that their child will have is worth paying for. Now, either they're completely wrong, or the market is kind of wrong, or there might be a problem with what you're saying.
Well, you know, if everything is constant and you reduce class size, you get more value. I don't think there's any question about it. But if that's not the question society poses, you know, the question is, if I have $1 more to spend, or £1 more, where do I invest it most wisely? And when you think about it that way, it is quality-related factors. You know, Japan is a great example. You know, Japanese classes are very large. Teachers are well paid for that, or Singapore for that matter too. And teachers have a lot of time to do other things than teaching, which is engaging in technology, engaging in professional development, looking outwards, working with other teachers. And at the end of the day, the results are a lot better because it's the quality of teaching that determines what students learn.
I wonder if anyone else has got a little voice at the back of their heads when we come to examples like Japan or indeed Shanghai that leads your most recent results table, which says, well, hang on, the culture is simply so different. Now, I know this is sometimes used as an excuse, but I want you to take this on because I do think there is, I mean, I was just talking to a colleague here, you know, we were trying to do our sort of pecking order of things you would change about education systems. I'm sure everyone in the room has them there, like, you know, they sort of haunt you whenever you sort of think, well, what would I do if tomorrow they gave me all the power and the budget? And a lot of people who know reforms quite well still, if you like, almost sort of secretly harbour a worry or a conviction that the external culture may be more important.
Well, you know, culture is always important, but you need to ask yourself to what extent culture is just inherited, I can't do anything about it, or created by what we do, by the work organization education, by the choices that we make, and so on. And in fact, the reason why I'm believing that is that you have seen change. You know, if culture would be the big determinant, Singapore had in the year 1960, 2% of the workforce that was literate. Today, they're one of the world's best performing education systems. They didn't change their culture. They changed how they used those kinds of cultural assets. Poland in Europe, dramatic improvement in learning outcomes. Now, again, they changed what they did. In that sense, I think those...
But hang on, there you have, I really want to challenge you on this because it comes out every time and it's always the same examples. I don't know if anyone else has ever had this feeling about it. You're choosing countries there which kind of have a national story. Either something has happened, something big has changed. Poland would be an example after 1989. But where, if you like, there is a great national push or a liberation, and that is harder to reproduce among underperforming or indeed middling performers who are just moseying along with reasonably democratic circumstances, but without that sense of a big national challenge.
I'm not sure. You know, I think the national challenge arises because public expectations may not be there. You know, I mean, the problem is we are not very good in telling people the truth about outcomes. And once you do that, people change. I can tell you the example of Brazil for me was absolutely amazing. When Brazil joined the PISA test, I met actually with President Cardoso at that time, and I told him, well, you know, one thing you need to be clear, you're going to come out at the bottom. And he said, well, you know, I'm going to be 41 out of 41. Turned out to be true. But, you know, the problem is every parent believes they're doing fine because students get good grades, school get good grades. Once they got those results, the country woke up, and you can see actually remarkable improvements actually being leveraged. My own country, Germany, same effect. I think it starts out knowing the truth and knowing the consequences that truth will have for my child, for my school, for my country. And I do believe that once people know, they actually do make reasonable choices. The value, the pressure being put on education is a healthy thing.
That transaction mechanism doesn't seem to be particularly quick. I mean, not all countries with quite bad outcomes, or certainly not outcomes that they should be cheering about, change quickly. I mean, the UK would be an example. It changes, but with a lot of fighting about what to do. And still, I wouldn't say that if you go up to someone on the street and say, do you know how bad your education results are relatively? They probably don't.
Well, you know, if you look at this, take the PISA example only. We have seen improvements from 65 countries in 40. 40 have seen significant improvements. There's a lot of really positive change in the world. We're not always good at scaling it, and often I must say that change is still incremental, whereas what we really need is transformational change. You know, getting away from this false choice between academic excellence and access, which is still in our mindset. You know, only some people can succeed. Yeah. Education is about sorting. And we have the technological means, we have the instructional systems, we have the capacity to actually overcome that. And I think that's still sort of quite rare, but overall I think there's good progress in education worldwide.
I'm going to go to the floor in just a moment, but just with your last thought in mind, what do you think the most promising development is in education that is likely to bring change in the next few years?
Well, in my personal view is that I think there is the prospect, the promise that education is going to become a truly global enterprise. We now have education is moving away from being an art to becoming a science in the sense that there are accepted global practices that are associated with success. And that was not the case when we discussed this 20 years, 30 years ago. People discussed, you know, what makes a school succeed. We know the answers to that. I think that and we know them globally. I think that's one thing. Second, we have technology coming up. Technology allows us to move content, to scale, and to customize knowledge, again, in ways that were not possible in the past before. We have policymakers willing to look outwards. You know, I mean, your country is a great example. You have a Secretary of State who actually goes to other countries, who's interested in other countries. And I think we are in a phase where the demand is global, the demand for skills and the willingness of, and the capacity of education to become a truly global enterprise. I think that's a great promise, at least.
Yes, it may occasionally be that politicians go to other countries and find exactly the bits that they thought already when they were at home, but perhaps that doesn't happen here in this part of the world. Let's go to the floor if we could. I'm sure there are roving mics, otherwise you'll just have to holler. Gentleman at the front, me being so short-sighted that he's the first hand I can see. Is there a microphone, or are we into the business of just shouting a question and I'll repeat it? Sir, do go ahead. Introduce yourself.
There comes a microphone.
Here comes a microphone. We need to break the land speed record a bit on the microphone, I think. No pressure there.
Slowly. Hi, my name's Nick Kafka from Teach a Man to Fish, based in the UK, but working in developing countries. I'm a bit of an Andreas Schleicher groupie. You know, I keep seeing you talking in different places, and I'm always really interested in what you have to say. I guess my question for you is a little bit like Anne's question. On the one hand, I see you giving great presentations about PISA results, and on the other hand, about the skills needed for the 21st century. And there seems a real disconnect between the two to me. You know, so my question is, what are the chances, do you think, that we can actually shoehorn some of these areas like problem solving, creativity, teamwork that are so important to employers and so important to young people coming out of school in with PISA, so that, you know, we don't end up with a situation where all the countries are scrapping over their PISA rankings and completely losing sight of some of the rest? And if you could do that, what would you include first? Absolutely. You know, we need to do a better job in aligning the metrics that we use for evaluating success with the evolution of labor demand. Actually, you know, there's a lot of interesting things happening. I can only talk of my area, PISA. On the 1st of April, we are going to bring out the first ever assessment of creative problem-solving skills. And you're going to see a quite different ranking of countries on this. In 2015, we're going to bring out... Go on, give us a clue. In 2015, we're going to bring out our first assessment of interpersonal skills, collaborative skills. You know, the world no longer... Innovation is no longer about you having a great idea, but you being able to mobilize ideas, connect the dots where the next innovation is going to come from. Very important. In 2018, we're going to have our first assessment of global competencies.
the capacity of people to engage with different value systems, different ideas, different beliefs, sort of the value of diversity in this kind of global multicultural world. So there's a lot happening in the field, maybe not fast enough, but you're absolutely right. If we do not align the metrics with the ambition, we're going to actually have the wrong incentives for people.
Anyone else like to come in? We have a microphone. Yes, the lady over at my direct eye line. Thank you. The long blonde hair and the microphone, I hope. And the microphone to go with it. Do you need it passed back, really, if you wouldn't mind just... We need a little help with the microphones for anyone who's fleet of foot. A Hermes.
It's coming on.
It's going around with a hide-and-seek game. Thank you.
Hello, I work with the GEMS group. I started a school in Switzerland, so I'm coming from the perspective of somebody who's did the IB for many, many years now. And I think we had the pleasure of meeting in Paris, because that's where I used to be, working very closely with the OECD and with students. I really have to say that I laud what you are doing now in terms of assessing critical thinking skills, because that's where we need to be. If we don't assess what we value, then nobody's going to do it. So now we're assessing it. That's really good news. What I would really like to see from a technology point of view is technology moving from ticking the thinking box or ticking the knowledge box to how are we going to use technology to transform critical thinking, to have those exchanges cross-country, cross-continent, and also crossing the social the strata. So thank you very much for implementing that.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the, I mean, technology is the enabler of those kinds of skills, but schools tend to be still quite inward-looking. You know, schools think in terms of classroom, school environment, and to mobilize that knowledge, to connect students is still, I think, something that schools could be doing a lot better. When we have our assessment of collaborative problem-solving skills, you can actually see that. In some countries, you know, you put students, you could put a group of 15-year-olds in a room, and within 5 minutes, they actually share their knowledge, they work together, they collaborate. You have other education systems, they're going to sit on their desk, and they do not know where to start. And I think this tells us that we do not have yet that culture of collaboration. In every curriculum, you see a statement how important interpersonal skills are. But at the end of the school year, you give students still an individual exam. So the sort of what we do is still not really well aligned with that.
Well, I wondered in a way whether your own approach in the PISA league tables wasn't exactly pulling against that. You know, if you've got a whole kind of competitive ethos, which is that you've got to maximize your number of points, why would I collaborate? I don't want to collaborate with you. You might get more points than me. Yeah. You probably would as well.
That's absolutely true, and then you can see that, but there are some countries in which those results align very well. Students are really good on their own, but they're also very, very good in sharing and mobilizing other people's knowledge.
So they're not mutually exclusive. Here is a microphone. Don't be afraid to use it. Oh, you've got it.
Hi, Mark Treadwell, New Zealand. Andreas, one of the fundamentals to what we do as educators is teaching young people. And increasingly now we're saying lifelong learning. So the next stage we need to look at very carefully is how does our brain actually learn and actually leverage that. So we have to teach how to learn from a sociological as well as a neuroscientific sort of perspective. Where's that feature in PISA?
Yeah. Again, absolutely right. The neuroscience is a lot further advanced than pedagogy and assessment today. You know, if you look at neuroscience, the only way how you do not learn a foreign language is to have on Monday one lesson and on Thursday another lesson. It's basically proven. And the only way you don't learn it if you start in secondary school. If you would teach English in sports, you would have much better results than teaching English in English. Now, we know those kind of things. Putting them into practice is still very hard in a school system that is framed around academic disciplines. Yeah. It's really about we have 21st century skills. We pretty much know what they are. Yeah. Developing 21st century pedagogies is the next big challenge that we have in front of you. Brain research, I think, is pretty well advanced. It's not the question that we do not know. It's a question, how would you translate it into pedagogical practice? And we've actually done something very interesting. We just, in June, we're going to publish this. We surveyed teachers on pedagogical practices. And we asked them two things. You know, what are the ideal pedagogical practices? And most teachers in most countries have a very, very good sense of what they would need to do. And then we surveyed, what's actually happening, and you can see that that is very, very different. There are too many walls in schools, between school subjects, between classrooms, between grades, and those walls prevent those 21st century pedagogy still.
And you don't think the exam systems, again, things that you test in some way is playing into that? It's almost as if the left and the right hand are beginning to sort of diverge a bit in this thinking. Exam systems vary. You take things like the IB and you get actually pretty close to those kind of things. You take the Chinese Gorka and you're probably on the other extreme of this. And actually, the Chinese school system is the one that suffers most from that. And everybody will tell you that. Right, anyone else? Yes, we've got the gentleman here and possibly, oh, sorry, you've already got one. You're ahead of me. Go ahead, and then this gentleman.
My question connects to, you talk a lot about 21st century skills, and then you mentioned interpersonal skills and how that might be assessed. I suppose I'm intrigued to know how you imagine that might evolve. Interpersonal skills are, in my opinion, the most important skills. And that without that, no one can be successful anyway unless they can communicate. And spending a lot of time working with children on interpersonal skills, eye-to-eye contact, shaking my hand, being able to ask a question, being able to lead and develop their thought process orally in 20 minutes for highly achieving schools in London, and an expectation to be very, very forward-thinking in the way they communicate at the age of 11. I wonder how that connects with your thoughts on how we might assess that more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, we have started out with assessing collaborative problem-solving skills. In an international setting, things like communication and interaction are very, very hard to capture, but collaborative problem-solving is something that we have a very good sort of sense of how to assess that. The willingness, the capacity of individuals to share knowledge, to work jointly on joint problems. And, children all over the world do that already. If you look at computer games, they're international and so on. And the one step that I'd really like to see in the longer term is move this kind of collaboration to the global level. That this idea of global competency becomes part of this. That I'm not only collaborating with people who are like me, the people who share similar values, similar beliefs, similar backgrounds, but that the capacity of individuals to actually engage with people who are very different from them. Now, that's really where the potential for development comes from. I think we've got one question here. This is what I've got at the moment. One gentleman, oh sorry, one here, and then someone over here. We must make sure we can see over here as well. So, you're next? I was next. You're next, you're certainly next. Okay.
Hi, Andreas. I don't know if this is a fair question to ask you, but, and I should introduce myself. My name's Christopher McDermott. I'm a GEMS principal here in Dubai. Before that, I was a principal in London. And my experience of being a principal in London was that the dead hand of politics and politicians interfered overmuch with education. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking you're the sort of person that everybody should be listening to, but I find that politicians and their own prejudices, which aren't based on objective fact, those opinions interfere too much with what happens in the education system. I don't know if it's fair to ask you the question, if you feel there's a way as educationalists we can lessen the influence of politicians.
I thought you were going to say, who would you shoot first? But same thing, but more politely expressed. But
I think you have already given the answer to that question. The more we succeed in putting real evidence, real data out into the education system, into the public, the more parents understand what education is about, the more teachers benefit from the practice of other teachers, the more likely, the more limited will become the room for what I would call political arbitrariness. If education becomes really a strong science where the teachers in the classroom own their professional practice in the same way as doctors in the medical profession own their medical practice. In that sense, the room for politicians to change curricula arbitrarily today like this, tomorrow like that, is going to diminish because you have real ownership at the front line. And in that sense, I'm pretty optimistic that we are moving in that direction. You can no longer make really big shifts without being publicly accountable.
So what I've learned from that, and thank you for your answer, that was a really good and helpful answer for me, because what I'm going to take away from that as a principal is I'm going to make sure that one of my jobs in my school is to ensure that my parent body is educated according to the sorts of information you're giving us, and that's my job to do that. Thank you.
We have real data on this. We've done a parent survey as part of the last PISA survey, and you can actually see the higher the expectations of parents, the more willing parents are to sort of engage with the education of their children, the more informed they are, the better the outcomes, the better the enjoyment of students to learn mathematics and all of those kinds of facets. So this is the client base is a very powerful angle to better results.
I think that came out very much in Vietnam, didn't it? When the sort of backstory of the big rise in Vietnamese math scores was that the parents rarely left the school alone, really. Yes, I think you wanted a word there, sir?
Yeah. Atif Aziz from Bahalpur Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Pakistan. As you were saying in the beginning of your dialogue that there's a great deal of mismatch between the skills which are required for employment and the education or what we are giving to the children and the youth. I see it so often, particularly in my country, that there is a mismatch of what is required in the real world as far as the skills is concerned. Do you have any success story or case study to share with us of any developing nation which have articulated their curriculum and their education system to answer the gap between the skills and the education and the requirement of the for the youth to be employed?
Yeah, I think there are some good examples. It starts out with employer engagement in curriculum design. You know, who actually thinks about what students should be learning? Is that something that is only framed by the academic community, or are employers actually engaged in this? And there are some countries where that is very strong. You have other countries where there's a lot of work-based learning, you know, where students have a lot of exposure to the world of work while they are studying. In some cases, going as far as having modularized education system, where you can do your first degree and then you go out to work, you can continue your education later on. And this idea of sort of making education a lot more personal, a lot more modular, a lot more open is something that has a lot of future, getting sort of deconnecting the provision of education from the accreditation, that you can accumulate your degrees and qualifications in a way in which you want to learn, where to study. And I think there are some very good examples of that. Employer engagement is a big struggle for many education systems, but also a great strength for some of them.
I think the question was there a specific developing country that you took heart from on that? Does anything spring to mind?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a country that has actually, what's very interesting, Singapore struggled with that issue, but has actually addressed it quite successfully. Singapore's vocational institutions were the last resort for people. You know, nobody wanted to go to vocational education there. Now they've become a place of choice for people because they've actually sort of changed those kinds of dynamics. China is trying hard in a very, not as successful yet, but I think there are some really promising developments in Asia too. In South America, you're not going to find much, unfortunately. There's still sort of a very strict divide between what education does and what the enterprise sector does. There you have many companies who provide their own training. But in my view, that's not the answer. That can be part of the answer. You want companies to be part of the education system, not to set up their parallel structures.
Yes, gentleman over here.
Thank you. I'm going to move here so that... So my name is Selim Edde. I work for SAP software company. I have a comment and a question. The comment, very brief, is that I would like to challenge the statement that technology is an enabler. Today it is a transformer. It's changing the game. And it will, in education, as an example, the role of teacher is changing drastically because of the use of technology. My question is is actually the same relatively as the last gentleman who asked the question. The biggest challenge is youth unemployment and alignment between education and the job market requirements. So we're looking at a demand-driven education rather than education for the sake of education, demand-driven education. So how are you looking as in your organization at the role of data, big data, social media, structured and unstructured, and how technology can help you better change that game, which is alignment of youth with job requirements and aligning the resources accordingly?
Very good question. I want to still comment one more on the first part, technology as a transformer versus enabler. One of the lessons that we have learned is actually that technology can leverage great teaching. If you have really good teachers, technology can make a huge difference. We have very, very few examples where technology has replaced poor teaching. I think we have to be very, very careful. It's really the combination of great teaching plus technology that changes the world. But if you believe that, technology can sort of supersede poor teaching, not so convinced. About the issue of youth unemployment, I think, first of all, one has to be really think carefully to what extent is this a skills-related issue, relevance of skills, part of the answer is there. But it's also a lot of this is skills utilization. In many countries that struggle most, for example, in Southern Europe, it's simply because we have made it very, very hard for companies and countries to actually get people into the labor market. There are so many, there is this dualism. Either you get a job that is permanent forever and so on, or you become sort of an intern for your life. And I think they're also part of that. But the question of data and big data is a very, very relevant there as well. We need to become much better, and big data is the answer to this, telling young people what are the skills that are going to help them to become successful. Imagine, who tells someone in school today, what is going to make you successful? No one. They look television, they see the media star, oh great, I want to become like this. But there is very little intelligence out there to give us a sense of the evolution of skill demand. Who provides people with the guidance, the kind of labor market relevant information on their fingertips? Teachers, great, ideally, but they don't have that experience themselves. Teachers haven't been out in the labor market. So data on basically what are the skills needed in demand. And from the employer side, big data to tell actually employers what skills are available. The problem is that we are still valuing people on their formal credentials. We are basically giving an education system a monopoly to decide who's qualified and who's not. And there's no way that you as an employer can see through that. So we also need to become much, much better in having evidence and data that tells us about the availability of talent. We need to move from qualification systems to skill systems that really tell us not, I'm a good example. I'm a physics graduate, but I've worked for 25 years in education. If you put me in a laboratory today, I'm going to do a terrible job because, the field has advanced and I've lost half of my skills in physics, but that's still what's on my CV, But I've also acquired new types of skills, not credentialed for, that I'm not going to be visible for. And I think moving towards those skills is, and this is all a story of big data.
Anybody else? We've got to move towards the close, but I would very happily take any last questions. Anyone out of our immediate eye line who'd like to ask a question? Or are you all so sated and fascinated by Andreas's responses? Anyone else? Yes, we have one.
Thank you for the very informative discussion. I'm Miss Nargis from Cambridge International School. As a teacher, I feel the curriculum might be moving too fast for us, the changes in teaching. But do you think at the moment, the current situation, how do you find teachers managing this change? And what are we doing for this, for the teachers, basically? We need to be leading before we
Good to hear a voice from the ground up there. Yep.
And I think what you say is so true. When you ask schools, they say reform is much too fast. When you look out in society, reform is way too slow to accommodate the changes that we need. What's the missing link? It's all investment in the profession. It is about mentoring. It's about continued professional development. And it's about, upgrading, moving the profession forward, where we can do so much better. And again, I come back to the issue of class size, Make the class size one student bigger, and you have a lot of resources for a lot of people to continue to learn, upgrading their skills. And that's something that we take for granted in many professions. And in teaching, it's still pretty marginal. The time that teachers have to work with colleagues, to upgrade their skills, to explore new things. Education is perceived by the profession itself as one of the most innovation-hostile environments. And it's supposed to teach entrepreneurship, supposed to teach education. And I think we could create a very, very different work organization in schools and education systems and change this. You cannot imagine that, the best minister of education in the world cannot change the lives of millions of students and hundreds of thousands of schools and teachers. But if you can mobilize the talent that is in the teaching force, the great successes that you see, scale them, bring them, create networks of innovation, you can actually change the education system. I mean, one very small system in the world that does that really well is Finland. You know, there are no performance differences among Finnish schools because every school knows what every other school is doing. There is actually, you do have this kind of professionalization embedded in the way they work, but it's the missing link. We can put new technology into classrooms, we can put new curricula into classrooms, but unless we move the workforce forward, you're not going to change reality.
Just at the very end, let me play devil's advocate on a 1.5 questions. One is, it sort of comes into my mind sometimes when I hear this kind of gathering very erudite people, I think broadly speaking, working towards the same goal if they have different ways of getting there. When you're back out there looking at the political battles around education, which someone referred to earlier, you can sometimes think, well, that's fine in Schleicher world. That shouldn't happen in Schleicher world, but actually it does. So when you go around the world and you see tensions with, say, teaching unions, your response seems to be empower teachers, train them better, make them better, and then things will be all right. If you're a reforming education minister, you may actually have fairly implacable opposition in the world that you inhabit now, in the time that you're likely to have the job. So when you hear that there's a sort of clash between teaching unions and a minister, do you sort of think, they must have got it a bit wrong? Or do you think, well, that's inevitable and I hope that they prevail?
Well, you know, I believe I've seen more change in the nature of unions than I've seen change in the nature of governments in the way they approach education. I mean, there are many countries actually where unions have become a real part of the profession. And I also would say, you know, I believe that every education system more or less gets the union it deserves. You know, if you have a highly industrialized work organization, if you have a highly industrialized work organization, you know, where education is regulated in working hours, teacher salaries, no career structures, nothing, you get those unions who fight those battles. If you have a professional work organization where there are true career structures for individuals, and teachers are going to value them, where there is an open profession, you know, you can move in, you can move out, you're going to have a very, very different union. The union's got to take on a very, very different role. I give you one example of that.
Yeah, please give some country name checks if you could.
Yeah, I give you one example. When Sweden introduced individualized pay in their schools, you know, the teachers and the unions were out on the street. It was a battle like they'd never seen before. 4 years later, when teachers had discovered, oh, actually, this is a great system. You know, I'm going to advance in my career. I can actually move forward. They had a 70% approval rate among unionized teachers. And the union changed. And I think we often sort of look at the battles as set in stone, rather than thinking about what's the professional agenda and how can we engage both governments and unions. And once again, you know, I don't think that unions are that much more conservative in their outlook than many governments to the way in which we work in education.
Final question, which I think I've wanted to ask you ever since I started reading and covering your reports. I think you referred to about 20 years since you left your first sort of career and moved into being the global education guru. What have you changed your mind about in that time?
Lots of things. In fact, you know, I entered this world with a mindset of a scientist. You know, that was basically the way I was thinking about the world, all mapped in Cartesian diagrams. And the one thing I've learned is actually what comes into this is people. No? And I think that's one of the big, if you think about, you know, success in education is a story of leadership. You know, if you take Canada, Ontario, Premier Dalton McGuinty, you know, someone who took on a rotten system, he got the ideas and the leadership together. And that's something that clearly as a scientist, you don't put into your equations. And I think that's something that has really transformed, to look at those kind of dynamics that you need to take into account to make reform happen. We know more or less what needs to be done. But, you know, there are short-term costs. We ask people to pay short-term costs for maybe long-term benefits. It's very, very hard to get around those kinds of issues. Now, that's, I think, something I struggle with every day.
Look, thank you very much, Andreas. That was extremely enjoyable, and also to you all for some very stimulating questions. I know you've all got other things to go to imminently, but if you could just give a quick round of applause for our guest, Andreas Schleicher.
Thank you.